Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University. And we work with hundreds of organizations that are working with, others in recovery, and they're doing what's called Christian integration, an attempt to try to combine the principles of the Bible and a biblical worldview with some of the best practices and techniques out of counseling. And there's been a lot of controversy around this, and is I've mentioned in some of our other videos, we've had probably 50 faculty in our addiction counseling department together. Each of them probably have 20 to 40 years worth of experience, and we've learned from them. We've learned from, hundreds of books in this space, and we've put together what we believe hopefully is one of the better thought out. How do you approach Christian integration so it's not something that's going to actually hurt people? So I'm going to talk about that. So let's start with something that's called the dualism heresy. And it's this idea that there's a secular and sacred divide. It's something that's considered a heresy by all Christians throughout the history of Christianity. It has relationships to what's called the Gnosticism heresy, which is kind of a sub-branch of dualism. And Paul Stevens, he's one of the great theology of work people, he said that the secular sacred dualism is the worst heresy of the Christian church worldwide. And ultimately, the reason why it's a heresy is it's very clear in the Bible that the whole world is sacred and under God. You can, read Ephesians 4:6, Isaiah 6:3, and Psalms 139:8, and, passages throughout the Bible basically say that there isn't, this dualism. So one of the things I want to talk about is, truth in the Bible. So there are a lot of truths in the Bible that are just black and white, but then there's also a lot of truths in the Bible that I would say what's called truth in tension. And that is, where there's an and rather than an or. So let me use some examples. So the sacred and the secular. And the idea behind this, in truth and tension, it's like a bow. You have to hold on to both sides of that, and you have to keep them in tension. And you need the Holy Spirit, you need the Bible, you need wisdom, you need community around you to really figure out what is the right balance on these things in each individual context. So another one is, word versus deed, or sharing the word versus deed. So a lot of ministries, are about evangelism. And are we only evangelism, or are we trying to actually help people with their physical and emotional needs and social needs? Then, faith versus works. And, this is one of the most challenging aspects of understanding the Bible. Is it all faith, or do we have to do works, and how does that work? And its intention. Because if someone just says they have faith, but then they have no works at all, that's a problem, James says. So, to put it in counseling terms, all boundaries, having super strong, super firm, rock, solid brick wall boundaries versus no boundaries. There's the phrase carry your cross. Sometimes Christians are just called to suffer versus, Jesus says, sometimes he calls you to carry your cross. Sometimes he says, my yoke is easy. So which is it? So there's the Great Commission. We're to go into the world and make disciples. A lot of evangelistic focused organizations are focused on that. But then there's the Great Commandment, love others and love God. That's all that matters. Well, sometimes those feel a little bit in tension, especially, that's related to sharing the word and deed. So, there's truth and there's grace and love. Sometimes, people have met others that they're all truth. They'll just say, calling out people and telling every person, every possible thing they might have done wrong versus recognizing what might be helpful, and when to hold your tongue. So grace and love. So then there's, justice, this person has to pay versus mercy and forgiveness. There's responsibility. And then there's freedom. There's, in Christian circles, you call it legalism. And then, where you're too strict, and then you have license where you're too loose. There's looking at spiritual causes. We're just saying, this is going to be caused only in spiritual versus physical, emotional, social causes, and not recognizing that those are integrated together. They're not separate. Then you have spiritual growth. The only thing we should focus on is spiritual growth and growth from counseling. or growth from counseling, psychology, and sociology. And then there's salvation and sobriety. So, some would say if we don't get people saved, then it doesn't matter if we get them sober. Well, there's some truth to that. But can someone continue to be saved if they get hardcore addicted to the point of death? That's going to be difficult. Not that if someone dies from a relapse that's going to put them in hell, but if someone embraces their addiction for the next 30 years of their life, it's going to be hard for them to stay in Christian community. And so these things they're in tension. So with that, I want to talk about, what some of the challenges are in this. And it's helpful to look through a cultural lens. So there's this tool called Berry's acculturation model. And he basically creates a 2x2 grid, and he says, is it important to develop relationships with a larger society? You could ask this, with Christians. How important is that to you? And is it important to maintain one's Christian identity and community? So I'm adapting this into the Christian context, but it's the same basic idea. And I'm using some Christian terms with this model. And he basically says you create a 2x2 grid of different categories. So if you say it's important to develop relationships with a larger society, but it's not important to maintain one's Christian identity and community, then you're choosing the path of assimilation or secularization. And in Christian integration or Christian counseling integration, this is what I would call weak Christian integration. So you're saying we're still Christian, but we essentially don't really have a lot of sophistication to that. And, I'll just use it as an example. There's a lot of Christians who they are strong Christians. They haven't assimilated as Christians, but the only schooling they've had has been in secular contexts. So they don't know how to do strong Christian integration. So the models that they're promoting are kind of in that space. Then you have this other thing called biblical Christian engagement, and that's where you're in the world, but not of the world. And that's what I'm going to call effective Christian integration or strong Christian integration. And then you have marginalization. So this is for people who it's not important to maintain one's Christian identity, and it's not important to develop relationships with a larger society. So, right now politically, there's a ton of people in the country. Whenever I grew up, they used to call them cultural Catholics because they were just Catholic in name because their parents were Catholic. But now you have this huge group in the country that are what I call cultural evangelicals. They call themselves evangelicals because everyone around them is evangelical, and that's just kind of the cool thing to do. And their parents were evangelical, but they don't go to Christian. They don't go to church at all. And they believe, largely it's a cultural and political term for them. So that's the marginalization group, and they're kind of isolationist. And then you have this other group that's separation. So it's important to maintain one's Christian identity, but it's not important to engage deeply with a larger society. So that's what I would call is fundamentalism. And I would say that's strict nouthetic counseling. And nouthetic counseling is a sub-branch of biblical counseling that is kind of, I would say, in general, the most isolationist. And just because someone calls themselves a nouthetic counselor, in my belief, that doesn't mean that they're going to be on the strict side, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, if you talk about the debate in this space, what you hear is this strict nouthetic counseling saying, well, you have to pick our path because if you don't do that, then you're going to go to this other path, this assimilation path. And, I grew up with this in fundamentalist churches where it's like, hey, if you use rock music, then you're going to, become a drug addict, or, if you dance or if you use playing cards. What that's called is that's an either or fallacy. There aren't only these two options. There's actual biblical engagement to be in the world, but not of it. So in the counseling integration space, there's a similar thing. So you have this anti-integration side, and that's, more on the isolationist. So it's this church gathered, not of the world. And then, the Bible says we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it. So they're very focused on the not of the world part. And then the church scattered or sent into the world. And, on this side, you have kind of the Bible only. don't use anything but the Bible in counseling. And so on this side you have more risk of separation and irrelevance, and on this side you have more risk of assimilation. So Christian counseling integration is attempting to do both. Now, you can have Christians that are just doing secular counseling because that's kind of the rules to be in a secular environment. And then you have anti-integration people, and I often meet people, especially at rescue missions, and they say, you know what, we're nouthetic counselors. But if you actually look at what they're doing, they're a nouthetic counselor that's also a certified addiction counselor, and they are using tools beyond the Bible in their counseling because they want to save people's lives and save their souls. And so even if they're flying the kind of anti-integration flag, what are they really doing? That's the important part. And what this group here is, they're trying to do effective integration. So that's where the biblical worldview is dominant versus weak integration, where the secular worldview is dominant. And so City Vision's approach to integrating faith and counseling is, there's basically, we use this book, Counseling Christianity, 5 Approaches. And, there's hundreds of books that have been written about Christian integration, and there's different schools of thought, and there's different, practices out there. So you have biblical counseling. And so just because someone's doing, biblical counseling, part of what you got to realize is, where is this mostly used? So biblical counseling is mostly used in churches. And I think it's the right model for churches because it's primarily pastors and Christian counselors in churches. And usually it's, predominantly by Christians for Christians. Occasionally you'll get non-Christians engaging with that. But then there's other schools of thought, transformational counseling. And then you have Christian psychology. And then you have the integration model. And so, a lot of these are going to be Christian counselors and Christian organizations that take insurance. In some cases, they might be, rescue missions or, different groups like that. And then over here, this levels of explanation is primarily Christian counselors and secular organizations. Now, we explain this model in detail in several of our courses, our Introduction into Christian Addiction Counseling and Fundamentals of Addiction Counseling. This left side follows a philosophy that's called Biblicism. And what that basically says is the only truth in the world comes from the Bible. And, people, a lot of people believe that Biblicism is a heresy because it basically puts the Bible in place of Jesus. And then on this side, you have what's called naturalistic positivism. If you can't prove it in nature, then it doesn't exist. So you can't even say that you're in love with your wife, because if you can't show it, quantitatively in nature, then you can't prove that, right? So now what City Vision does is we teach across 5 perspectives on counseling and Christianity. So the range of what we teach, we intentionally expose students to a range of views, recognizing that our focus is on strong Christian worldview integration. So, one of the analogies I often use is there's a lot of people, I grew up in the city and I used to live in Boston, and I got very savvy on what were the dangerous neighborhoods or non-dangerous neighborhoods whenever I lived in the inner city in Boston. And I would tell the students, don't go down this street at night because you'll get robbed. And I just knew how to navigate. And inevitably I would get, some people, some interns that would ignore what I said, and they'd go down that street and they'd get robbed. Well, the other solution that a lot of Christians in Boston had is they just said, I'm not going to go into the inner city because it's too dangerous. So it's kind of the same thing with counseling. You have to know the streets. You have to know how to navigate, and that's what we try to teach people. But what I want to do is I want to talk about why a lot of Christian counseling programs, and especially Christian recovery programs, are very cautious and kind of stay over on this side here. And I think that they do that for good reason, but I want to explain some of the reasons for that, and some of the risk of that whenever you start to go over here. So now, one of the reasons why a lot of Christian recovery programs are, focused on, kind of this left side is this side's dominated by, academia, and it often will look at things that are more difficult to change. So Christian recovery, the fundamentals of Christian recovery is to focus on things you can change, as we've talked about in other lessons, the circle of control and the circle of influence. But then there's just a lot of academic knowledge. This is a serenity prayer, a lot of academic knowledge that you just can't influence. There's all these societal reasons that might drive people to addiction. Well, you're not going to change society. You need to focus on yourself right now. And a lot of academic teachings, focus on that. So as I've talked about before, there's this 4-quadrant approach to understanding the causes of addiction. Well, the reality is a lot of what comes from these other academic disciplines are in these other quadrants. And people who've been around for a long time and have counseled for, decades in addiction counseling, they realize that there is this tension where a lot of people in recovery like to blame other other things. So these, let's blame society, let's blame the culture, let's blame, my biology. And then what that does is it absolves the person from personal responsibility and the things that they can change. So because of that, there's been kind of this reaction. I think recognizing there's some good reason for that, and also recognizing that a lot of academic disciplines have been in spaces that have largely been extremely secularized, have extremely secular worldviews that are very hostile to Christianity, and they are dangerous for people to engage with. In the same way, going into a dangerous, neighborhood, you have to know here's the safe streets, here they aren't. But what happens is, because of that, a lot of the fundamentalists say disengage with the selective academic disciplines, withdraw from the world. So you'll take all these different disciplines, and you might cross out part of them. Okay, so some of the humanities are okay, and we'll I kind of think about this as many people have heard about Thomas Jefferson's Bible, where Thomas Jefferson went through the Bible and he crossed out all the lines he disagreed with, and there's a problem with that. Now, in this case, what Christians are doing, and I believe that Christians should cross out aspects of these disciplines that are completely counter to a biblical worldview. But what in many cases they're doing is they're crossing out the entire discipline. So counseling, the entire discipline of secular counseling, any of the lessons that are learned from that, psychology, parts of biology, psychiatry, we're not going to look at that. And, I cross out nutrition and exercise science, not because a lot of the fundamentalists, would say biblically they're against it. It's just they don't practice it. It's not, something that's encouraged. And then you have all these other things, gender studies, cultural studies, anthropology. Okay, some music might be okay. Classical music, yeah, that's good. Worship music's good. But, some of these other musics, don't learn those, because that's too dangerous. And even learning about other religions, not worshiping them, but learning about other religions. And then you have other disciplines like sociology, part of political science, part of economics, part of history, most of ecology. And what happens is, essentially what they're saying is, any discipline that has become too hostile to Christianity, has too many flaws within it, we're just going to exclude that completely. And the problem with this is it limits our tools in recovery. And so, in the previous session, I talked about having a 4-quadrant holistic plan for self-care and recovery. And what that does is it takes these other quadrants, and essentially we're limiting the tool set. And we're going to say we got the hammer, and everything's a nail, and we're only going to use the hammer because the hammer's the best tool. The Bible is the best tool. I believe it is. But I believe we need to have more tools in our toolbox. So there's all these other things that essentially get crossed out, in secular counseling groups and treatment, as an example. I believe in Christian counseling. I train Christian counselors. I, spent 15 years in counseling and in recovery groups. I had a 15-year period of that. About half of that was in Christian counseling. About half of it was in secular. I chewed the meat and spit out the bones on the secular side, but there's many cases why I needed that. There's a lot of groups that just aren't available. There's a lot, sometimes the secular counselors might be free from insurance or things along those lines. And it's important, to recognize risk there, that they're going to have a different worldview, but to recognize there's value. And we don't want to be, doing what Jesus, said that we want to avoid, is putting millstones on people's necks in their recovery. So, having said all that, here's another way of framing this. And as I've talked about, what is holistic recovery? And, we talk about all these different domains in this course and in the Wounded Healers program that we're trying to help people, do. And healthy biblical counseling, I feel like its posture needs to be, and this is what happens in a lot of churches that I think is just great. And, a lot of rescue missions can be in this category. It says, we are good at and prioritize biblical and Christian techniques of managing thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And often those are the best places to start an addiction recovery. So, you say, okay, we're going to use Christian, what's called CBT, and we're going to help you in managing your thoughts and your emotions. We're not going to say these other quadrants don't exist. It's just going to say this is what we're good at. So we're going to apply these different principles on behavior, your core beliefs and thoughts, and your emotions. That's fantastic. That's what, a lot of groups should good at. This is what you're called to do. This is what you're good at. Do that. Now, where this gets to be a problem is whenever you start to apply this dualism heresy, this toxic fundamentalism. You say that all these secular things, never go into a dangerous neighborhood, and then you're putting a millstone on people's necks. You're saying the secular is bad. A lot of these other things, a lot of these principles that may come out of, some of these other, secular disciplines or things along those lines, let's just not do that. And, a lot of these groups wouldn't say, okay, let's not do boundaries and self-care, but there's tools that can be useful in each of these spaces that we're throwing out. And that's where it starts to be a problem. And honestly, from a counseling ethics perspective, you're supposed to provide disclosure to people. And if someone comes into a program, it's important that you let them know before that you're basically saying these things we're not going to do, right? So, and you have to also let them know that, if you think that these things are bad for them to ever do. Now, all that I want to put, I started saying truth and tension. So you now may be thinking, okay, so Andrew, where do you fall in this? And where is wisdom in this? So I think it really where you fall in that truth and tension, and how cautious you're going to be and how, much freedom you're going to give. It depends in where you are in your progress. So I like to use, instead of, using the term recovery, I like to use the term rehabilitation in this diagrams, because if you use the term rehabilitation, often that's used as a term in recovery. I went to rehab, right? But it's often used in physical recovery. And I want to use some pictures as an example of that. So in stronger boundaries and more freedom. So, and the idea is that if you have less progress in recovery, more risk of relapse, you're going to need stronger boundaries. In some ways, those boundaries may feel really legalistic. And honestly, that may be what you need at that point. So let me just use some examples. So if you are at the highest risk, you see this person in a body cast, right? And you say, that's just not a good way to live. You're in a body cast. Well, you got to have your bones renet. You have to have, get some stability in your life. So for some people that might be incarceration. They go into prison and they get sober because they're not, they don't have access to substances. They can't be around anything. So then the next step is, might be residential recovery. Okay, you're still in a wheelchair. A lot of residential recovery programs will have no contact with friends, no substances. You have this defined schedule. You might have separate men's and women's programs without, cross-gender interaction. And you may say, you know what, that feels super legalistic to me. Well, again, you shouldn't be out running if you have broken legs is kind of a part of it. So then let's go to the next. So an aftercare program. Okay, you got the walker. You're going in and you see the people, trying to rebuild their legs, and they're using their walker. So in this case, you might be in a situation where you just can't be around alcohol. Or a lot of people have a history with pornography addiction. So and I've worked with a lot of guys around pornography addiction, and some of my friends, they have no computer, no phone, no internet device in their home. That seems super restrictive. Well, if you look at the alternative, it's better than the alternative for them. That might be someone who's going to, recovery meetings twice a week, 3 times a week. And, their friends say, okay, now you're addicted to recovery meetings. Well, you know what? Is this person addicted to their walker? We hope that they're going to move on from their walker. And I think that many of us are going to need, at least a cane. So recovery, meetings every week. I know a lot of people for the rest of their life, right? So this might be a transitional living program or something along those lines. So there's still some restrictions. And then for a lot of people, they might become a ministry intern at a Christian recovery program. So there you're walking around, you still might have some crutches, and that's fine. And for a lot of people, and some of the other restrictions here, there's approaches to medications. So a lot of residential recovery programs are cautious about medication, psychiatric medications, especially those that might be habit forming. And there's a lot of Christian programs that if you're going to be in the program, they don't want you on methadone. There's a lot of secular programs where they might require you on methadone. And in the reality is what they're trying to do is they're trying to get you towards another level in your recovery. I mean, I would view methadone as being a little bit more on like being a body cast. Methadone might keep you from killing yourself, but it's definitely not a path to freedom. Or some people might consider it, more like a wheelchair. But the reality is that there's a lot of medications that can be habit forming. There's a lot of medications that also lend themselves to abuse, especially anti-anxiety medications, and pain medications and things along those lines. So. And the other thing you got to realize is, some restrictions might be permanent. So, some people have to have a brace. Some people may have to be in a wheelchair the rest of your life. So you don't really know where you are in the spectrum till you see how you're able to rehabilitate your ability to walk, right? So then people might become staff in an addiction recovery program or staff, somewhere else. And then, if you're in an addiction recovery program, ultimately where you're trying to get is where you can run again, right? So senior staff. And ultimately what happens is, I use the spectrum and I said, well, where are you in your process? How much risk can you take? Can you go into the dangerous neighborhoods? Well, there's certain neighborhoods you're probably going to want to avoid for the rest of your life. There's certain things that this is going to be a trigger for you. And, I myself am not around people using drugs ever. And that's just how it's been ever since I've, gotten sober. There's just other things that I just should never, be around. And for some people that's alcohol or other things. So ultimately what you have to do is you have to accurately assess where you are. And the tendency is to think you're farther along than you are. And you have to balance taking steps forward with what you can handle. And typically it's better to be too cautious than too weak. And I shared some of my own story of, having an addictive personality. Whenever I realized I needed to enter some counseling and recovery, I was probably closer to, this wheelchair level. And I thought, well, the way I'm going to get better is I'm going to cram, and I can do this all in 3 months because that's what I did with everything else. Well, whenever you got broken legs, cramming by saying I'm going to do twice as much running is not the best path. So you have to listen to other people. And a lot of times that may be if you're working or at a place or, serving as an intern, trusting them some. in your process, and not just throwing it back and saying you guys are too legalistic, but trusting the process. So hopefully this has all been really helpful. The goal is to maximize your growth in recovery, maximize your connection with God, your ability to love others and to love God. So if you have any questions, please ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot.